Okay, well, let's see if this thing's going to go live. It still isn't showing me that it is, so I'm going to wait until I see, yeah, some icons are showing up, some people. It's, like I say, the internet connection around here is really iffy, and you just got to deal with it. And on this situation, of course, I have to use my phone. And I'd sure appreciate if y'all let me know for 5x5 or at least something close to it. Thank you very much. I appreciate that one. Now, this time of day, there's a lot of traffic going on, a lot of people using the cell towers. I'm not on my actual internet connection. I'm having to go through my phone. So we might have some interruptions. I apologize for that, but I figured this was the best time to actually do this because of circumstances and what I have to present. So I hope you don't mind. Yeah, it's been a few days. You might hear a little sound like, my nose is plugged up. I got it. My friends know what happened. Some of those who follow me on YouTube too. Actually, I got some food poisoning, and I threw some of it up. I vomited, and I aspirated it. So it caused me to have some really bad irritations in my throat and my nose and even in my lungs. So yeah, that's what happened. Okay, so I haven't got the dreaded bug. Okay, that's not it. It was because of that. So yeah, I'm still kind of recuperating from that. I've been coughing that stuff up, so it was pretty nasty. I'm lucky I didn't get a major bout of pneumonia out of it. I won't go into what I was eating. The poor lady that made it, it wasn't really her fault. It was just one of those things that happened. So if you'll bear with me on that, I'll appreciate it very, very much. And let me make the statement that up front tonight, this is a spiritual type of journey that we're going to go on. Yes, it has applications into what's happening in the world today because our world is godless. It thinks that anything goes, and unfortunately that even happens amongst those who consider themselves spiritual or religious, that the good will take care of it and we don't have to worry about it. And of course that's not the case, and that's been my mantra for a very long time. There are terrible things going on right now. This isn't the time for me to talk about those. However, I do recognize that it's happening, as you all know, and I talk about those things all of the time. Some months ago, I made the decision that we needed to start talking about some of the things that could help us spiritually to get through this very, very difficult time. And we're just feeling the real slight pains of it now. It's going to get worse, I'm afraid. So that's the reason why I'm going to cover this subject. And I'll have to tell you a couple things, okay? Uh, I was actually asked to do this presentation by Roosevelt and some other people a few weeks back. And I was concerned because it's a very difficult subject to approach for a lot of reasons. Lisa, Utah. I didn't know they had a Lisa in Utah. Hi, Lisa. So I gave it a lot of thought, and I wasn't sure. I had my notes and everything. I've been working on it for a little while, but I wasn't really sure what I was going to do it. And then today, almost miraculously, someone sent me a video about the Thanksgiving hymns in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and you know who you are if you're watching tonight. I was stunned because, of course, one of my areas of study has been the Dead Sea Scrolls, and as a matter of fact, some of the things I had prepared for my presentation on this involves some verses out of the Thanksgiving hymns in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And when you find out the background of this, which I was also surprised that the individual giving the presentation mentioned, when you find out who wrote those, or the evidence is pretty strong about who wrote them, it if it doesn't affect you emotionally, just me even thinking about it right now makes me emotional. And I'm not going to give it to you until the end of the presentation. I'm going to read those passages. Uh, and I just want to warn you that I may lose my emotional stability when I read those because they're penetrating. And you'll find out why when we get to it. The Dead Sea Scrolls have been suppressed even when they came out publicly, thanks to Dr. Eisenman. There's been a concerted effort to really keep those things back in the first century BC, first and second century BC, because if they admitted that they were part of the first century AD, that it would alter Orthodox Christianity, traditional Christianity, and the claims of those organizations and institutions uh, detrimentally in a lot of ways because of what the historic the early church fathers said about them or didn't say about them, as the case may be. But they are authentic, and they give us a real glimpse into what first century Christianity was really about. And I've talked about it in my Eisenman series and my religion series that had to do with the Messianic movement that was driven by Ezekiel and by Daniel in the Old Testament. So in the description box below, you'll find two links. The first link, very worthwhile, takes about a half hour to get through. It's this presentation on the Thanksgiving hymns in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Very good. I was very surprised at how well the individual covered it, and that I've never heard of him before. So it's very good. After we get done here, when you have time, I'm going to cover some of it, but he goes into some other detail, which I'm going to leave to him because I want to cover it from a slightly different angle, as I've said. And then the second link in the description box is to a New York Times article. Now, there's a problem with the New York Times. If you've checked in to read the New York Times site too many times, then they want you to pay for a subscription. And I apologize for that. But this was a 2008 article, and it talks about a stone that was found that goes along and is even written in the same kind of way that the Dead Sea Scrolls are. And it talks about what I discuss in my book, The Crimson Thread, the Messiah ben Joseph, the suffering servant, who was really the one who was crucified in the first century. It also goes into some information to show that Stone does, which is in that New York Times article, that they expected that this Messiah, this suffering servant, would basically be resurrected in 3 days. So that both of those links very much go along with what we're going to talk about today. So with that little bit of information, let me tell you why I named this, titled it the way I did, that your giving may be in secret. Why Jesus was an historical non-event. And in reality, that's what he was. Historically, considering what was going on at that time, there's really nothing there unless he goes by some other names, as I've mentioned before, like Athronges, or like Judas the Galilean, or one of those, which I don't think are the person we're talking about. It's definitely someone else, and I've identified that again in my book, The Crimson Thread, and in my Religion and Eisenman series. However, the only historical information we really have are very scant. Of course, it's in Josephus. I've talked about it. The Testimonium Flavianum, which is probably a tongue-in-cheek or by Josephus, or it was an assertion later by people that had an agenda. And there's also the Acti Pilati, the Act of Pilate, which Epiphanius talks about, but we really don't have anything on that. He just says that Pilate talked about crucifying this particular guy, and that's really all it says about it, other than it gives the hint, as I've said, that the individual is probably actually the Taheb, who is not from Jerusalem itself, but from north of there, and that that particular Teheb has all of the, Teheb means restorer of the law of the Torah is what it means. Has all of the trappings and ingredients of who you would think to be Jesus Christ. Okay, so historically, there's really not there. What we're going on are the things that were written in the Gospels and in the Pauline epistles, with, of course, the information from First and Second Peter, Jude, and James, which I give a lot of credit to. Also, as I've said, the epistle to the Hebrews, which I don't think is really all that Pauline. There's a lot of Pauline in it, but it also comes quite a bit from James. But I've covered all of that before. So I just, with that little beginning information, I wanted to get out to you so that you know kind of where I'm coming from in case you haven't followed me very closely. But those are in my playlists on this channel. If you go to the playlist, you can go there and you'll see the Eisenman series and my religion series. So that'll give you some background information. Okay. The reason that Jesus, I'm going to be using my notes because this gets very complicated. Okay. All right. The thesis I'm presenting to you, what we're going to go and look at today so that you can kind of focus. So this is kind of to give you a parameter to where we're going to talk. That's why I gave all that other information up front. Now we're going to really focus in on this. The thesis of this presentation is that the reason Jesus' mission, but especially the resurrection, hi Felicia, is shrouded in so much controversy and historically is a non-event, was partly by design, both by God, but also by the Roman Empire, and you'll see why in a few minutes, and because the real issue here is on you. Despite what Christianity, and a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, so if you don't want to discuss this, feel free to go. I certainly understand why. This is a spiritual discussion. If you're not interested in that, you can go ahead and go away. But it does impact what's happening today, and it's going to impact on the future as well. So it had an impact there with the Roman Empire because the Roman Empire was involved in a war with the Jewish Messianists who were waiting for their king to come and throw out Rome. So there was, as I've talked about before, this big, huge military intelligence campaign and actual kinetic warfare to try to subdue this area. And there were a lot of people that came up at that time saying that they were the Messiah, and most of them ended up crucified. And this went all the way up through 135 AD with the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and I've talked about that before. But what this ended up being was that there was a problem with the Messianists. One of the reasons why they became so invigorated and so dangerous was because they believed in a resurrection. They believed that them being for God, that God would reward them with a resurrection. That was one of the things. So Rome had to destroy that initially, or at least alter it to some extent with another thing. And that other thing is what James talks about, which is the royal law, the perfect law of liberty, loving your neighbor as yourself, which I've talked about before, which Jesus is quoted as saying, and loving the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and strength. Those were the important aspects that were being pushed by the Messianists. The resurrection was the second part as to why they would do those things, but that was never the central theme of early Christians. Was the resurrection, was the death and the resurrection. It was never that. It was always righteousness and piety, loving God and loving your fellow man. So the resurrection didn't have much going on there. Nobody talks about it. The only place you find out about it, of course, is in the New Testament as far as the event itself. It's a non-event in history. There's nothing other than Josephus And even that, like I've said, is very suspect and doesn't give you a whole lot of detail. I mean, Josephus, as I've said, he's going to call Jesus the Messiah when he had already called Vespasian the Messiah, and that he could have been killed for doing that. Number one. Number two, this guy, that Josephus talks about, he agrees that he's the Christ, whatever that is, according to, the Hellenization of things, and that he suffered and then he rose on the third day. So you're going to tell me that Josephus just mentions in one paragraph a resurrection, coming back to life of somebody who's been crucified? One paragraph? No. No. This was put down because it would give the Messianists a reason to continue to fight. After the war was over, then, and especially after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, then the idea of the resurrection started to take a little different point, because they were selling something, to tell you the truth. They were selling something. Okay? And you'll see that as we go through tonight. So that's kind of where we're going to go. This is probably going to be kind of long. I hope not too much, but we'll see. Okay? All right. Let me read Matthew 6, 3-4, because that's going to set us up for what we're going to talk about tonight. Matthew, for those of you who want to follow in your Bibles, we're going to be at Matthew chapter 6, and we're going to read verses 3 and 4. Okay? And this is what it says, which is the title of my video. Matthew chapter 6, verses 3 and 4. But when thou doest alms, let not thy left hand know what thy right hand doeth, that thine alms may be in secret, and thy Father which seeth in secret himself shall reward thee openly. How does this have anything to do with the resurrection? What was the greatest almsgiving that's ever been done? Is this just telling you this? Or did Jesus himself receive this instruction? Remember, he always used to say, don't tell people anything about me. When he'd heal somebody, he'd say, don't tell anybody. Or if he did, he said, well, go and tell this person, or you can tell this priest or whatever. But it wasn't something that was broadcast widely. It was kind of kept down. So, Jesus followed this himself. The resurrection was an alms to all of us. It was a free gift. And as such, it wasn't made a big deal of, because it was important, as I've told you before, to Jesus and to James and to Jude and to Peter, etc., was righteousness and piety. That's what they concentrated on. Not death, not even the resurrection. That's a hard pill to swallow, but as we go through this tonight, you'll see that that is actually the case. So it's not the belief in something that's important, but a willingness to make a stand on principle. Even Paul admits, faith can fail, hope can fail, but what can't fail? And he got this right, and he got it from James. Love, charity, that will never fail. Some people who had trouble with spouses might disagree with that, or girlfriends or boyfriends, but you get my point. Okay? All right. What about Jesus historically? There's literally nothing, as I just said. The closest is possibly the acti piety mentioned by Epiphanius, and that's probably likely the Teheb that I've already mentioned, and that's in Josephus as well. Okay. There's no real concurrent historic info until Josephus, the testimonium which has a problem with it, I've already explained. Historically, James is the main emphasis from Josephus, Hegesippus, Epiphanius, Irenaeus, etc., etc. And then you get some other things put in there by, of course, Jerome, Justin Martyr, etc. But those are all people pretty much in the 2nd century on, not at the times that all of this was going on and occurring. Okay? All right. The question is why? And especially the situation surrounding this momentous resurrection of someone who had been crucified. I've already mentioned that the number one reason was war. As far as the Messianists was concerned, amongst them, and it was kind of a closed system, it was to give them hope, to allow them to make these sacrifices and realize that it wouldn't be in vain. And for Rome, they wanted to negate it initially until after the 1st century because it was a way to cause more fear. If they could avoid the concept of resurrection amongst the Messianists or negate it, then it could possibly work against the Messianists, right? So that they wouldn't want to fight anymore. You see how that would have worked amongst all the other propaganda, etc., that I've talked about both in my book and, of course, in the series in the playlist that I've discussed. The second reason, that was the first reason. The second reason is, as the same point that I make in Eisenman and my religion series, in my Eisenman series and my religion series, that even James, if you go look at the Epistle of James, there's really no mention of the resurrection, not obviously, right? Same thing in Jude. So James did not push the resurrection. And it's certainly not in the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I've already explained, which a great deal of them were in the 1st century. They were in the time of Jesus. And yet, even when we get some of the later, there's still no mention of a resurrection per se, easily found. There are a couple of exceptions, and we're going to talk about those tonight. So, again, they weren't pushing the idea of the death and resurrection of this individual. The important thing, hi Roosevelt, the important thing was that you practice righteousness and piety every second of every hour of every day of every month and year. That was the push, that you had to do righteousness and piety. That was the issue that bound all of those 1st century Christians together, not the resurrection or the crucifixion. That's why James doesn't mention it. He's trying to convince people that was Jesus. That's what he did. You have to do righteousness and piety. That's what you do. Hi, Jesse. And that's why you see no mention of it in James, Jude, and very little in some of those other like Peter. Oh, Paul's all over it because I'm going to say something here that's going to get some people very upset. Paul did it for money. And he did it to subvert the Messianic movement, as I explained in my book, The Crimson Thread, and my Eisenman and Religion series. Paul was an infiltrator. In the Dead Sea Scrolls, he's identified with the liar, the boaster. And believe it or not, the teacher of righteousness of Qumran was probably James. And so this argument was between James and Paul. And I've talked about how, in my Eisenman series, how Paul eventually not only attacked James, but was instrumental, kind of on the side at least, by setting him up for his eventual stoning and death. James, I mean. A lot of this is hitting a lot of people really hard right now. And like I said, if you want to go, that's okay. But you really need to wait till the end, because I have something that's going to really, it'll burrow into your heart. I promise. I promise. So the things that were really important were righteousness and piety, not the death and resurrection of Jesus. That was the way early Christians looked at it, not the way it was sold later. Paul was our first televangelist to get money for it. And James approached him on it. You'll see this as we get on it later. James said, okay, if you're going to collect that money, you're going to give some to the poor. And it doesn't mean the poor like the people out on the street, begging for money. It meant the community council in Qumran. It meant the priests. Okay, so the Dead Sea Scrolls, James and even Jude, do not emphasize the death, crucifixion, or the resurrection. Again, personal righteousness and piety were always the emphasis. Always. And as I just said, Paul was really the first one to push it, because he was approaching the Gentiles who had Dionysus, for instance, and all of these other gods in the Roman and Greek pantheon, where they talked about virgin birth and where they talked about, these gods that were born and then died and then were resurrected. So there was a ready audience for Paul. And he saw an opportunity, both because the Romans wanted to subvert the Messianic movement and destroy it with an infiltrator from inside by changing the doctrine. Yes, he was appealing to the pagan religions of the time, and he was getting money for it. And I'm going to show you those today if you've never seen those in the New Testament. So he was our first real for-profit televangelist, was Paul. And he and James went at it a lot. You can find this information on these situations that I'm talking about. I'm just going to read you the scriptures. You can look them up later. If I go through them too close right now, we'll get bogged down. 1 Corinthians 9. All right. Peter 11, verses 27 to 30. I'm sorry, not Peter. Acts 11, verses 27 to 30. Acts 21. 1 Corinthians 16, 1 to 4. 2 Corinthians 8, 1 to 9 and 15. Romans 15, verses 14 to 36 and 30 to 31. And Galatians 2:10. I probably went over those pretty fast, but believe me, if we read them, it would really take a lot longer tonight. I'm going to read a couple of them here in a few minutes, but I wanted to give those out now so that you can check what I just told you about with the money. Okay? Again, as I pointed out in my different series, Eisenman and Religious series, the poor and the meek meant the community council and the community of the Dead Sea, the Qumran community of Essenes, who were in fact the first Christians. That's who it was talking about. And what is referred to as the sons of Zadok. Not the priests of the temple that were being, all those temple services at that time were being done by Herodian puppets. Herodians being appointed by Rome, not even legitimately priests by the genealogy. So the Qumranians had the sons of Zadok. What does sons of Zadok mean? It means righteousness, sons of righteousness, the ones who did the law. As Jesus put it when asked about it, he said, not one jot nor tittle shall pass from the law until all is fulfilled. And it wasn't fulfilled in him. We had another 2,000 years at least to go through. I was going to make a little side note here. But I think I'll avoid that. It has to do with the dietary laws. I'll just say that one thing that you'll notice when you look at the payment thing there that I've given you in those scriptures is that one of the things that they were concerned about is the offerings to the lower priests so that they could support their family. So the sacrifices that were made both with animals and with money went to the priests so that they could support their family. So it was an economic requirement. And there's some indications also that had also to do with the dietary laws. Because if you think about it, the Phoenicians were kind of their enemies, the Philistines were their enemies, and they had different food supplies. They took different things to the market. And I'm just throwing this out there. I'd said I wouldn't, but I'm going to go ahead and throw it out there. Not saying that, pork isn't bad. I'm not saying that, or that shellfish, you probably shouldn't eat. I'm not telling anybody that, because the Torah talks about this, but I'm saying that there were probably more things at work here than you realize. So if you go into a market and you've got an Israelite there selling lamb, and you've got, a Philistine selling a pig, if you buy from the Philistine, you just ripped off your brother. You see what I'm saying? Okay, so there were more things going on here than just the idea of unclean things, because there's some definite, and I did this on Twitter the other day, somebody who wanted to get in an argument with me about whether the Bible's infallible or not. Well, you read different sections of the Bible and it's okay to eat all creeping things, and then in other parts, especially in Leviticus and Deuteronomy, you're not supposed to eat certain things, right? So there are these different things that are set up, and people say, well, God changed his mind, or God just gave a new commandment. Well, if he's not the same all the time, then you can't depend on him. Sort of like Alex Jones when he jumps on Trump one day and then he's telling him he's a good man the next. I mean, you can't deal with somebody like that. So something else is going on in those Holy Writ, and you have to be able to look at it, and we're going to see some of that here tonight. Okay, what is some of the evidence of resurrection? Do we have any? Well, there's the Shroud of Turin. That's really all we got. We have the situation, and there's a lot of controversy over that, but in my mind, the Shroud of Turin is a piece of evidence that has no question about it. It definitely is the burial cloth of the person as Jesus Christ. And I've talked about what Jesus Christ is. It's a title. It's actually Greek. It's not Hebrew, but it'll get the job done. You'll know who we're talking about, right? So I do believe that's an evidence of it, and I think it was intended to be an evidence even to our day. Other than that, we don't have much. We have supposedly a bunch of dead people arose shortly after Jesus rose, and they were seen walking around the cities. I think that said, 200 of them or something like that. Very possible. I'm not saying it's not. Frankly, I think the resurrection has been ongoing since the resurrection of Jesus. And I've talked about that a little bit in the past. But in fact, what is the evidence of the resurrection in the Old Testament? We're told that Abraham didn't really know about it, and, they didn't really understand the plan of salvation. Well, I don't buy that. They just didn't get the reward of it in their lifetime. But if we want to find evidence of the resurrection in the Old Testament, we have to do a little thing called reverse engineering. We have to understand the culture of the time and the language. And a lot of people don't go to that effort. They pick up their King James Bible here and they think that this is exactly how it is. And they don't understand that they don't get the cultural understanding. They certainly don't understand the language when they're reading it in any other language other than Hebrew. Greek in the New Testament, I don't even worry about. I do it, but that's not an issue for me, because I know that if what's said in the New Testament doesn't jive with the Old, especially the Torah, you have the Torah, then you have the whole Bible called the Tanakh. Tanakh stands for Torah, Nebiim, Ketuvim. Torah being the first 5 books of the Bible, you'd know it as the Pentateuch, right? The Law of Moses, for instance. Then you have the Nebiim, those are the prophets, and the Ketuvim are the writings. The writings would be things like Psalms, that kind of thing, okay? And prophets, of course, like Isaiah. So we have to do kind of a reverse engineering. We have to look at what the resurrection was about and then use that to reconstruct, to reverse engineer things that are in the Old Testament that may not have talked about it in the way that they did in the first century. Partially because they didn't understand it. As I was discussing this with the other day, the idea of a resurrection was kind of foreign to the Hebrews, to the Israelites at first. Even though there were some things in the Egyptian culture that they knew about, they really weren't sure how it all really was supposed to work out. So when you read it in the Old Testament, it's there, but because you're not aware of the culture and the language and the way it's put together, you miss it. So we're going to talk about some of those right now. I've often talked that in the Garden of Eden, man was not created in a corruptible state. Man was created as an eternal being in the physical form. And it says there, God formed man out of the dust of the ground and then blew into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became what? A living soul. You are a living soul. You are a combination of God's Spirit and the form that he made you out of the earth. Okay, when you were formed in your mother's belly, that's the formation of the dust of the ground. And then when you're born, the spirit of life, actually it's before that, but the idea is that God has given the spirit into that. Your spirit comes into that form that's been created, formed by God, that body. And the body and the spirit are the soul of man, and it says so in Genesis. Let's read it. And I've gone through this before, and I know some of you are going to say, man, this is all repeat. Wait till we get to the end. And I don't know if I can read this stuff in the end without bawling my eyes out. I'm just warning you. Genesis 2:7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. Your soul isn't something that's out here floating around like so many people want to talk about. That's the spirit. The body, enlivened, given life by the Spirit. Those two together are the soul. Okay, some words out of the Strong's. Okay, let's talk about this a little bit. What we're hearing there in Genesis is a process. We know about Ruach. Ruach in Hebrew means breath or spirit. Ruach HaKodesh is the breath of the Spirit or the Holy Spirit, is how we would translate it. It's not how it says it in the Greek, of course, but we're not talking about that tonight. Okay? We're talking about the Hebrew. Ruach HaKodesh would be the Holy Ghost, Holy Spirit. But it's used, and the first time it's used is in Genesis. But when it's talking about the formation of Adam and the breath of life, the Spirit of God being put into him, they're discussing the process. So what is breath? Breath is word 5397 in the Hebrew. It's neshama, which means intelligence. Wow, figure that out. So what God's intelligence is put into you? Well, if you understand the sparks and all that, which we won't get into tonight, all of this was made spiritually first, but I'm not going to get too far in the weeds. The bottom line is breath, word 5397 is neshama. It means intelligence or spirit, your spirit. Blew, God blew into him, blew into his nostrils. That's word 5301, which is nafok. Be careful how you say that. Which means to blow hard, inflate like you'd inflate a balloon. Literally blowing air in, almost like a resuscitation. Life, I think most everybody knows the term. Chaim, you've heard people say l'chaim. L'chaim means to life. That's the word. It's word 2416. So we're seeing here a process. It's not just spirit. It's not, and the body's not called a body. It's called the forming of the man. Formed out of the dust of the ground. So it's an explanation of the process of his body. Okay. What's not fully understood by most people, as I said when I first started talking about this thing with forming of Adam out of the dust of the ground, was that he was in a condition where he could not die. He was immortal. Genesis 2 through 4, Genesis chapters 2 through 4, show that this creation of Adam was to be eternal. The tree of life, and I've explained what that was before, that's really God himself, was there, and they were to partake of what God had. But there was that other tree as well. And they were told not to partake of that, or they would die. They'd go from mortal to immortal. So, in other words, what we're after here is not to go flying off in some incorporeal cloud somewhere, playing some immaterial harp to God for eternity. This is our inheritance, this world, this earth. This will be our home. The state that we return to is the Edenic state, not the premortal existence, meaning pre-earthly creation, all right? No, it's the pre-mortal experience of immortality in the Garden of Eden. That's what we're going back to. That's the goal. When God places cherubim and the flaming sword to guard the tree of life, every way of the tree of life, what does he say? He says he's doing that so that Adam will not eat of that tree and live forever in his sins. So men now, if you understand the metaphor, who are trying to develop technologies where they can live forever in their sins, isn't that the same thing as eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the bad thing, and then so that you don't die, you run over to the tree of life and just take it, whether or not you deserve it? So it's Babylon all over again, the Tower of Babel that they're doing now, just technologically. So in other words, the possibility of immortality, even in sin, was possible if they did something with that tree of life, and God had to put the flaming sword and cherubim to guard it so that Adam couldn't put forth his hand and eat it and live forever in his sins. He wanted him to live forever, but he wanted him to be able to live free of sin. And being free of sin doesn't mean without sex. Okay, a lot of people get into that. We're going to actually talk about that a little bit tonight too, because that wasn't the concept at all, not even in the first century. Okay, let's read a few things here again. And I hope I'm not losing anybody. You'll see where this is going. I just got to give you some of this background information first. Okay, let's go to Psalm 16:10. And I've done this before too, but it's important because it bears on what happened in the first century with Jesus, the person you know as Jesus. And that was not his name, by the way, as we talked about before. It was not his name. 16:10. And this is, hopefully you all are there, 16:10. This is David talking. A lot of people say, well, this is just talking about Jesus. And it's even some indication of that, the way they kind of emphasize things in Acts. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. Let's read this first, though. Psalm 16:10. For thou wilt not leave my soul in hell. Remember what soul is? Soul is your body and your spirit. So he's not going to leave either one of those in hell, right? And the important part, neither wilt thou suffer thy Holy One to see corruption. Well, if you're not going to leave your soul in hell, that means the soul is going to be brought back. It's a resurrection in Psalms 16. That's exactly what that's talking about. In Acts, it says the same thing. I'll go ahead and go to Acts 2, just so that you can see that they did talk about it, but they approached it from a slightly different angle because everything was about Jesus at that point. And that really was never the intent. But I know people don't want to hear that either. But Acts 2:26 to 31. And this is what it says. Therefore did my heart rejoice, and my tongue was glad. Moreover, also my flesh shall rest in hope. Now, this is a New Testament thing, so you kind of figure the resurrection business would be there. But then he quotes Psalms that I just read. Because thou wilt not leave my soul in hell, neither wilt thou suffer thine Holy One to see corruption. And then they go on to primarily push that towards Jesus, but the idea of the resurrection is still there. Let's go to Ezekiel 37. And again, a lot of people asked me to do this because they wanted to know if there was anything in the Old Testament that supports the resurrection. Okay, and that's what we're going to read here. Ezekiel 37, 1 to 12. This will take me a minute, but a lot of people will say, well, this is about Israel. This is just about bringing Israel back. Remember, prophecy has more than one purpose. So the purpose here is not only the bringing back of Israel as a people, regathering, it's also about bringing forth a resurrection of the people themselves. Let's read it. Ezekiel 37, we're going to read 1 to 12. The hand of the Lord was upon me and carried me out of the spirit of the Lord and set me down in the midst of the valley which was full of bones, and caused me to pass by them round about, and behold, there were very men in the open valley, and too, they were very dry. And he said unto me, Son of man. Now, why would he be calling him the Son of Man? Any of you Christians have any idea? God's talking to Ezekiel and calling him the Son of Man. Ben Adam. Why? And he said unto me, Son of man, can these bones live? And I answered, O Lord, thou knowest. Again he said unto me, Prophesy upon these bones, and say unto them, O ye dry bones, hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God unto these bones, Behold, I will cause breath to enter into you, and ye shall live. And I will lay sinews upon you, and will bring up flesh upon you, and cover you with skin, and put breath in you. Ye shall live, ye shall know that I am the Lord. Old Testament promise of resurrection in Ezekiel. Strength of God. So I prophesied as I was commanded. And as I prophesied, there was a noise, and behold, a shaking. And the bones came together, bone to this bone. And when I beheld, lo, the sinews and the flesh came upon them, and the skin covered them above, but there was no breath in them still. Then said he unto me, Prophesy unto the wind, prophesy, Son of man, and say to the wind, Thus saith the Lord God. Told you. Come from the four winds, O breath, and breathe upon these slain, that they may live. So I prophesied as he commanded me, and the breath to them, and they lived, and stood upon their feet, an exceeding great army. Then he said unto me, Son of man, these bones are the whole house of Israel. That's a key there. Behold, they say our bones are dried and our hope is lost. We are cut off from our parts. This isn't just an allegory of the nation of Israel being revived. This is both a resurrection and the recombination of Israel as well. Therefore prophesy and say unto them, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, O my people, I will open your graves and cause you to come up out of your graves and bring you into the land of Israel. Let's go to Job 19. You might hear I might have to have a little quick break here because of my my throat and stuff. It was really nasty, and I got a lot of difficulties down in there, so I might have to take a break here and get that out. Okay, so we got Job chapter 19. And this just and by the way, this isn't just healing him of his sores, okay? Job 19, 25 to 27. Job 19, verse 25, we're going to read through 27. For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth. So see, we're setting a time frame here. This isn't just Job getting healed of his wounds, his sores. And though, he's talking about in the latter day, and though after my skin worms destroy this body, yet in my flesh shall I see God. Don't denigrate your flesh anymore, ladies and gentlemen. I've talked about that before. You control it with the Spirit, but don't denigrate your flesh. It's a gift from God. Let's go to Daniel. And again, these are all necessary, and you'll see that as we get to the last part. Daniel 12, 1 to 3. Daniel 12, 1 to 3. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which standeth up for the children of thy people. And there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation even to that same time. And at that time thy people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. What is everlasting life? Is that just forever? Is that what that means? No, it means living the God life. So some are raised to living the God life, eternal life, the life of the eternal one. And some are raised to an everlasting life of contempt. They don't make it to the top. That's what that's saying. Now, the really truly evil ones are thrown into the lake of fire and they have to go back through it. We could name some of those current ones right now. Dr. Fauci, Gates. I don't want to be their judge, but I think that's pretty obvious when you start killing children. And many of them that sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake, some to everlasting life and some to shame. So they are brought back to life, but it's not God's life. It's not the godly life. And everlasting contempt. Okay, let's read. Let's read verse 3 too. And that be wise shall shine as the brightness of the firmament. And they that turn many to righteousness as the stars forever and ever. Let's read Hosea 6. And stay with me till the end. You really got to stay with me till the end. Hosea 6. Hopefully we're keeping the connection too. Everybody know if we've still got the connection. Hosea 6, 1 and 2. Come, and let us return unto the Lord, for he hath torn, and he will heal us. He hath smitten, and he will bind us up. After 2 days will he revive us. In the third day he will raise us up, and we shall live in his sight. Whoa. He will do that in 3 days for us? Or is that just for Jesus? We're going to get to that in a few minutes. Now there's some extra biblical, in the Catholic Bibles they have the Maccabees, so that's still in their Bible, but there are some extra biblical explanations of the resurrection. 2 Maccabees chapter 7 verses 1 to 42 and 46, it actually says live again forever. And then 2 Maccabees 12, 43 to 45, and 2 Maccabees 15, 11 to 16. I'm not going to read all of that. I just want to tell you the story, and I talked about it before. In the New Testament, there is a story of, and Jesus talks about it because they come to him and they say, well, what about the resurrection? And Jesus says, yeah, what about it, right? Because the Sadducees didn't believe in the resurrection anyway. And they say to him, well, you know, there was this man who had a wife, and he died, and his brother married her. This is Levitical. You'd marry your dead brother's wife to bring up seed to him. That's a Levitical law. There's nothing wrong with it. But he died, and then the next brother married. He died, and the next brother. This went on for 7 brothers. And so they ask him, well, whose wife is she in the resurrection? And this is totally misunderstood because you didn't know the culture of the times and you didn't know where the story came from. Well, His answer is because they don't believe in the resurrection anyway, the Sadducees. But he also said, you don't understand the law, because obviously she remains the first man's wife. Now I'm going to read something to you out of this. Okay, so if you have this, go to page 829, because this is going to be, I think Eisenman does the best job of explaining this of anybody that I know. And I'm going to read it right from his words, because he's going to explain what I just told you about. So if you have this book, I hope I got the right one here. 31. Yeah. Okay. Again, go to 829, and we're going to read this real quick. Actually, let's go to 830. Let's skip some of this for time's sake. Let's go to 830, and about halfway down there it says this. In the parody of these things in the Synoptic Gospels, some of the Pharisees, our ubiquitous some again, with the Herodians, this is an important addition. The Herodians, of course, were not chosen by the people. They were Roman impostors into the priesthood. Sent out spies to ensnare Jesus about whether or not it was lawful to pay tribute to Caesar. Okay, so we're into that whole situation there, right? Then down at the bottom of the page, this is what it says in the last paragraph there. After this, a group identified as the Sadducees comes, for whom there is no resurrection. The very words used in 2 Maccabees 7-14 above. Of course, the Sadducees are all the party Josephus identifies as denying the doctrine that the dead could enjoy immortal life, the knowledge of which Acts also portrays Paul as evincing, Acts 23-610. Now, we've already shown in the Old Testament that there is resurrection involved in that, right? But let's just keep reading the story, because there's more. We'll get to the Dead Sea Scrolls in a minute. The situation being caricatured here in the Gospels also parodies the story of John the Baptist and the arcane Jewish legal custom of Levite marriage. I just told you about that. You marry your dead brother's wife to bring up kids to your brother. Being alluded to there in this episode, relating to the 7 brothers, each rather being portrayed as in turn leaving no seed behind and therefore marrying the wife of the next. So we're talking about the situation in the Maccabees, and he's going to explain it to you here. Thus, instead of a noble encouragement to martyrdom on the part of the mother to her 7 sons, which is talked about in Maccabees, so they're making fun of this martyrdom of these Maccabean heroes is what they're doing to Jesus. Thus, instead of a noble encouragement to martyrdom on the part of the mother to her 7 sons, a thing few Jewish mothers would encourage even today, to die for the holy laws of their country, taking note of the doctrine of resurrection, as in Maccabees. Here, each brother is basically portrayed as marrying the wife of the previous brother, and the tragic pathos of the original story turned into something resembling a comic farce. This is the way it's written in Matthew. I don't think it was like that originally. It was played with sometime in the 2nd or 3rd centuries. The Sadducees, because of course it is known that they supposedly do not believe in the resurrection, perhaps these Herodian Sadducees did not, but the Qumran Sadducees did. In other words, the followers of James, Jesus' brother. They did believe in a resurrection, but not the Herodian Sadducees, the ones who were controlling the temple at the time of Jesus. Then ask the nonsense question, which brother will go or get whose wife after the resurrection? Not only does this completely trivialize the basic zealot resurrection ideology, it shows clear knowledge of the direct connection of the 7 brothers story as it was told here in 2 Maccabees to the doctrine of the resurrection. Do you understand what I'm telling you here? The story of Jesus, they're talking about the 7 brothers who take that woman. And then he says, well, in the resurrection, there's neither marriage nor given in marriage. There's neither male or female. That's not what he's saying. He's saying the Sadducees don't get that. because the Maccabees did believe in the resurrection. And that's what he's talking about here. Again, the mother, knowing that her sons would be resurrected for giving their lives up for the holy law. Not to mention knowledge of Josephus' portrait of the Sadducees generally. It also makes a mockery of the hope of resurrection being expressed in the willingness to undergo torture and the steadfast attachment to the law described in Hippolytus' picture of his fourth group of Essenes and Josephus' fourth philosophy, followers of Judas the Galilean and Zadok, that is Zadok. What did I say a few minutes ago? The doctrine of the resurrection gave the Messianists who were fighting Rome courage to do the fight. So Rome was doing some things at this point in time to try to discourage any belief in the resurrection. That didn't change until Paul, and it really changed in about the 2nd century. The emphasis was never on the resurrection, it was on righteousness and piety. Okay, this is going to be interesting. I don't know if I should bring this one up either. Nah, I'm not going to touch that one. Not this time. Some people say, why bring it up? Well, because when Jesus says that he wishes that you would have life and that more abundantly, it includes the power to procreate. And I know most people don't want to hear that, but the idea of a resurrection is actually primarily male. Well, that's going to really get, I'm not saying the women aren't resurrected. I'm saying that there's a process here, and that the promise to the male is that they will have that ability restored to them. Okay? I'm just telling you, that's what it's all about. Okay. Let's move to the Dead Sea Scrolls. Pardon me for a minute. Like I said, I got to take care of this little thing in my throat. Hold on a minute. Boy, I'll tell you what. It got burned really bad. Okay. So we've shown that there were concepts in the Old Testament about the resurrection. We've read Ezekiel, we've read Daniel. We've shown how in Genesis the idea was to go back to the Edenic state where they were immortal as men and women in bodies. Okay? That's where we're back to, right? Okay. Well, what about the Dead Sea Scrolls? And I was asked about this as part of the question. Do the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about the resurrection? And the answer is yes. But it was kept quiet by the Bibliothèque Nationale, the Israeli Antiquities Authorities, and a lot of the scholars who were involved when the Dead Sea Scrolls first came out, because the principle of how the resurrection was going to take place was at odds with the Christian notion of it for the last 2,000 years, and they didn't want to disturb the institutional integrity, if you could even call it that, okay? Because there was a problem with beginning with Paul subverting the doctrine of righteousness and piety and of the law, and especially of his selling the idea of the resurrection for money, which again I've given you and it'll say in there, well, it's for the poor and all that. Well, that's because James said you need to give the money to the, you're not going to keep that. You made a lot of money. As a matter of fact, because you made all that money, Paul, and you brought these Greeks down here, they're supposed to go, if you're going to take them into the temple, you better pay for their purity things because you've got the money to do it. So there's all this indication that Paul was in it to destroy the Messianic movement and to make money from it. He was best friends, family members with people like Herod. He even greets. If you read in there, you can read about where he has all these greetings that he does, and he's talking to Herodians primarily. Greetings to this Herodian and that Herodian, to Nereus. Go look at it. You'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, so in the Dead Sea Scrolls, let's go to the Habakkuk Pesher. It says this, quote, "The elect of Israel shall stand at the end of days." It's a way of saying a resurrection without saying it. Okay? It talks about the standing one ideology. To stand, you have to have life. So they're saying that they will stand up. They will again arise in the last days. The Damascus document, and let me read a little bit about what that's about. Again, I'm going to read out of this because it just makes it easier. I'm going to go to 695. Out of the Damascus document in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And we're going to read at, and then 843. Oh, this is important because it shows, when I was talking about the righteousness and piety thing, this has ties into the resurrection, but it has the importance of what gets you to that point. And it's not Jesus's vicarious atonement that does it. There's still a lot on you. I mean, that's kind of the seal that covers the last distance, but not in the way it's preached today by and large. So let me just read this. It says, relating to all of these expressions exactly parallel vocabulary in use at Qumran, the Dead Sea Scrolls. The standing in particular directly preceding the three nets of belly. The three nets of belly are the three really major sins that they were dealing with days with the Herodians in the temple. Condemnation of the Damascus document. Relating to the elaboration of the sons of Zadok, this, it will be recalled, has something to do with there being no more joining to the house of Judah. What? This is in the Damascus document. There will be no more joining to the house of Judah. But this is in the Damascus document of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You'll see where this matches into the way this is all worked out for all of humanity. But it says, joining the house of Judah, but each man standing on his own net or watchtower. Either of these would be equivalent to what Paul is intending by word or gospel here. This is not to mention the relationship of this word standing generally to the standing one doctrine of the Ebionites. The Ebionites are basically the Qumranians as well. And other Jamesian groups we have already signaled above, and elaboration of the doctrine of resurrection generally. Again, you have to understand the culture and the words and the meanings of the words. Let's see, what did I lose here? Lost my place. Okay, back on course. Let's read page 843 if you have this book. And this is what it says. I should have my glasses on. I don't know why I don't. But page 843. Let me make sure that's right. Yeah. This gets a little complicated because you have to understand the atom, the use of the atom ideology and some other things. But let me read this to you because it'll still I think help you to solve the problem. Okay, it says again. Page 843. But early as he is, even Papias came at the stage when information was already highly mythologized. It is interesting that Eusebius also associates him with the mention of the Gospel of the Hebrews. He attributes to him as well an ideology well known in the Damascus document from Qumran, but which Eusebius himself terms mythological. After the resurrection, there will be a period of 1,000 years when Christ's kingdom will be set upon the earth in material form. Eusebius finds this doctrine puzzling. Why? He doesn't find it puzzling. He's trying to destroy it. Eusebius was the guy who set the Council of Nicaea up for Constantine. If you don't understand the problem with that. You probably need to do a little more studying. Eusebius finds this doctrine puzzling, guessing that Papias has misinterpreted apostolic accounts perversely. No wonder Eusebius finds this doctrine puzzling, calling Papias of limited intelligence and unable to understand the allegorical nature of these things. Not only is this doctrine directly enunciated in the Damascus document, right? The idea of the Messiah reigning for 1,000 years in the resurrection, living for 1,000 generations, is explicitly drawn. It totally flies in the face of the description of the kingdom and the resurrection that Paul gives. So why did Eusebius do that? When talking about the first man, Adam, becoming a living soul, and the last Adam, a life-giving spirit, that's not just talking about Christ. It's talking about the whole situation with Adam in the Garden of Eden, that he started off immortal, fell, and that he will be returned to that immortality as well as his children. Okay? That's what that's getting at, and you'll see that really strong here in just a minute. And I know some of this is really taking some time, but it's very important. Okay, we're going to read something now. Now, this is where we're going to have some tears. I've given you a lot of background. So what we've been talking about is that the resurrection, the concept of the resurrection was well known even in Old Testament times. Maybe not by all the Hebrews generally, because they didn't really have the concept there entirely, or how it was going to come about. But it was definitely there. We saw it with the situation in the Garden of Eden with Adam, right? Being in an immortal state, going to a mortal state, and then at some future time, of course, he'll be replaced, and or go back to the Eden, and I'm going to show you that here in just a minute. We've talked about, oh, got the wrong thing here. Okay. We've talked about Ezekiel, Daniel, and all of that. Okay, so we've in Psalms, all the indications that the idea of a resurrection was in the Old Testament. Okay. And I think there was one other one I wanted to bring up. Let me see if I didn't mention. No, I think I got all the ones. And we talked about the situation in Maccabees, right? And also in Hosea. Okay. All that, now we're in the Dead Sea Scrolls. We've just explained the Habakkuk Pesher, where it talks about the elect of Israel will stand again in the last days, meaning a resurrection, right? The Damascus document, we just explained that. And then this, and this is really incredible. This is from, remember I said when the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, of course they're still finding some over there. I mean, you know, they're finding fragments all the time, but a lot of the things that were found were suppressed. They did not want those things to come out. So they kept them under wraps. And it wasn't until Dr. Eisenman sued them that they became known generally. And they're kind of extant today. But even today, they've still suppressed some things. And this is one that came out recently. I want to read this to you. Now, from here on out, I can't guarantee I can keep my emotions, okay? Especially when we get to the last little bit here. In the Dead Sea Scroll fragment 4Q521, it discusses the Messianic apocalypse. This is in the Dead Sea Scrolls, ladies and gentlemen. It mentions a single messianic figure, the resurrection of the dead, and the sign of the Messiah. Quote, "The heavens and the earth will listen to his Messiah, and none therein will stray from the commandments of the holy ones. Seekers of the Lord, strengthen yourselves in his service, piety, righteousness. All you hopeful in your heart, will you not find the Lord in this? For the Lord will consider the pious and call the righteous by name. Over the poor, his spirit will honor and will renew the faithful with his power. and he will glorify the pious on the throne of the eternal kingdom. He who liberates the captives, restores sight to the blind, straightens the bent, and forever I will cleave to the hopeful and in his endless mercy. And the fruit will not be delayed for anyone. And the Lord will accomplish glorious things which have never been. For he will heal the wounded and revive the dead and bring good news to the poor. I'm going to save some of the rest of this for later on another about the days of Noah and why it's so wrong for them to be with God's code of life, our DNA, and what they're doing now with the chimeras and all that. We're bringing destruction on us. God's got to destroy this because he won't let them play very long like this. That's why he wiped us out back in Noah's day and many times before, as I've talked about. We've always gotten to this point when we become arrogant and we wanted to become gods, and we start messing around with God's life code, and that's when he comes down on us. But I'm going to cover that a little later. I want to continue on this because this is where, let me give you a little background. In the description box, as I said, is a video about a half hour long of a guy who talks about the Thanksgiving hymns in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was miraculous, really, that, and again, that's why I decided to do this today, because when I realized that he had put this out, and it was just a few days ago, I thought, I'm supposed to do this presentation today. I was going to wait until I was better, feeling better, and I realized I needed to do it now. Now, when you listen to that, he's going to say some things that are quite startling to you. Okay, he's going to attack Paul like I do. He's going to tell you what he was really about. He's going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran, James, and Jesus. And he's going to talk about what the atonement was really about. And it's not the way Paul presents it, and it's not the way the church historians and fathers started to present it in the second centuries and on forward. It's not that. When I was first studying my Hebrew and my Hebrew mysticism and those things, I had a very good teacher, a very wise old sage who was in possession of some very, very old writings. And he posed a question to me, and this is what he said. That's right, BP Earthwatch, Jesse. And no one puts new wine into old wineskins, or else the new wine bursts. That's right, exactly. That's right. And one of the things he said to me was, you've seen the quotes in the New Testament of Jesus, right? And I said, well, yeah. And he says, have you ever wondered why he never wrote anything down himself? I mean, he was such a great man. Why wouldn't he have written anything down? I said, that's a good question. Now, I knew about the Dead Sea Scrolls at the time, but I wasn't really as far into it as I should have been at that point. That came several years later after some other events. But the question to me again was, did Jesus write anything? Did he ever write anything down? And then he answered me before I could think about it much longer. And he said, Jesus wrote so much that it would fill volumes. And some of it is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, this is where I might lose emotions. You're going to hear the words that Jesus wrote himself. Okay? Not the entire thing, but the parts that I thought would be best to conclude this presentation with. he did write volumes. And when you read his words, not the words that were attributed to him by those who were telling the story in the Gospels or the epistles, but his very words that he writes down, you come away with some very interesting insights. The first is, he had no pride. None. He considered himself a man. He considered himself tempted, fearful in that he wanted to do the right thing, and he feared that he may not. What's apparent is his humility. No guile, no pride. And he definitely exemplifies a broken heart, a contrite spirit. I'm going to read 3 passages. The hymns are primarily his in the Thanksgiving hymns. They're almost all his. There are other things in the Dead Sea Scrolls, but these, I think, really give you a feel for who this man was and is. And yes, he is the man on the Shroud of Turin. He was the first man, as this great sage told me. He was the first man to realize the benefits of his religion for himself and his loved ones, and those that he chose to be with him, who managed to do the righteousness and piety that he so often discussed, and that his brother James discussed and taught. Not the death and resurrection, not the televangelist gathering money, but how to really be, how to be chaya, how to exist, how to be. Listen to his words. He wrote these. May I blow my nose? Hold on a minute. I remember when I first read these some years ago, it really tore me up. And again, in the description box below, the first link there is to a 20-minute or 30-minute video that talks about the significance of these hymns or psalms. It means the same thing. Okay, let's see if I can hold myself together here. I probably won't. Again, you're going to hear humility, no pride, no guile, and a broken heart and a contrite spirit. Not some guy who's saying, I'm going to take over the world. I'm Jesus Christ, and you better obey me. You better do what I tell you. You better believe in me. You better believe what I tell you, because if you don't, I won't let you into my kingdom. You're not going to hear those words here. This is Jesus writing this. His real name, as I said in my book, was the 4th brother, Joseph. Joseph was his given name. Joseph was his nickname. Jesus Christ is an appellation of doing the Messianic job. So here are his words. I've got 3 of these. This is number 17. Part of it, not the whole thing, the part that I thought would help for us tonight. Quote, for the sake of thy glory,
Thou hast purified man of sin, that he may be made holy for thee, with no abominable uncleanness and no guilty wickedness, that he may be one with the children of thy truth, and partake of the lot of thy holy ones. That bodies gnawed by worms, remember what I read there? In Job, even if his body was gnawed by worms, he would see God in the flesh. That bodies gnawed by worms may be raised from the dust to the counsel of the truth, and that the perverse spirit may be lifted to the understanding which comes from thee, that he may stand before thee with the everlasting hosts. He's praying for you. He's praying for me. He's praying for his followers at that time, and he didn't have many. He was a non-event in his time. He didn't seek fame and fortune. He really was rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with grief, lonely. 23. Quote, that they may serve thee faithfully, and that their seed, posterity, may be before thee forever. Thou wilt keep your oath, and wilt pardon their transgression. Thou wilt cast away, not me. I'm not going to cast away their sins. I'm not going to take them upon me. No, Father, you do this. I'm just showing the way. And he didn't even admit that. Thou wilt cast away all their sins. Thou wilt cause them to inherit all the glory of Adam and abundance of days. What did I say about Adam in the Garden of Eden returning to his immortal state? Body and spirit, the soul of man. Hold on a minute. I'm surprised I'm actually holding it together as well as I am. Now you're going to hear him talk about himself. This is where we're going to end. 25. Quote, for into an ear of dust, his ear, thou hast put a new word, and hast engraved on a heart of stone things everlasting. Thou hast caused the straying spirit to return, that it may enter into a covenant with thee, and stand before thee forever in the everlasting abode, illumined with perfect light forever. With no more darkness, for unending seasons of joy and unnumbered ages of peace. He did not receive a fullness at first. Those are his real words. And there were many more. Those are just the ones I picked up to end tonight. These simple things have been hidden from you, and you've been told lies for 2,000 years because people want to control you. Oh, it's a beautiful story. But that's the real deal. And Pilate did crucify him because he was standing against the world of his day. He didn't get crucified because he was teaching the Beatitudes or that stuff. He was doing it because he resisted. He endured to the end. He resisted the evil of his day. Even though I know in Scripture, you're going to quote something where he says, resist not evil. Well, you got to know how to rightly divide the Word of God and know when Rome's speaking and when they're not. I would hope that what we've shown you here is that the resurrection was talked about prior to Jesus, that it's not just in a particular cultural colloquialism in the Old Testament, but it's actually there, and then it's certainly in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And I'll tell you about this. He probably wrote this in his early to mid 20s. '22, 23, 24, 25. And there's a lot more. And they're hiding a lot of it. I would not be surprised if a lot of this isn't in the Vatican vaults, because it will not vindicate Roman Catholicism, Martin Luther. And I'm not coming down hard on you if you believe those things. Because there are a lot worse things to believe in. I'd almost believe in those than, certainly the things that are going on in D.C., London, New York, etc., etc. If you know what I'm talking about. I don't want this thing to be taken down because I use a wrong word. But the real truth of the matter is the deathbed salutations and declarations of belief don't cut it. If you have the time, I'd suggest not all the Dead Sea Scrolls were written by him or by James. Some were written by other people, other scribes, other priests, other Zadoks. But you'll at least get a flavor of what was really going on, not the Romanization and the mythologizing that happened starting with Paul and then on through the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th centuries to the present day. And I will just leave with this. As humble as he was, no pride, no guile, held himself to a high standard. We should be doing the same. As James puts it in his epistle, true religion is this, pure and undefiled, to take care of the fatherless and the widows, and to keep yourself unsullied from the world. We can't stop the wicked from what they're doing. All we can do is not partake in it and defend the helpless the innocent, and to remember to stand upon pure principle alone, even when it's not convenient, and if we're the only ones to do it. So in ending, there's plenty of evidence of the resurrection, and God was kind enough to leave us that little receipt in the Shroud of Turin. I've done a lot of study on that. The real deal. And as he said there, thou wilt cause them to inherit all the glory of Adam and abundance of days, abundance of life. I would that you would have life, and that more abundantly. Thou hast caused the straying spirit to return, that it may enter into covenant with thee, and stand before thee forever in the everlasting abode, illumined with perfect light forever, with no more darkness, for unending seasons of joy and unnumbered ages of peace. Something to have a goal for, isn't it? You'll be reunited with your loved ones. Not saying it'll all be easy to do. I'm not so sure that's the case. But it'll be workable. And if we can emulate the humility and the lack of pride and this broken heart and the contrite spirit that is evident in that writing I just read you, then we'll be following his example, which is really what was all about in the first place. I guess I could take a few questions. Walter, nice to see you. Okay. Roosevelt, do you have anything in particular to throw out here as far as a question? Like I said, I wasn't even really going to do this if it hadn't been for that. They sent me that video that's in the description box, the first link. Then I knew I had to do this today. There is no tribulation, rapture. The tribulation's going on. There's no rapture the way that it's taught in Christian circles now. It doesn't work like that. It just doesn't. I think Jesse has done probably the best job of explaining what the tribulation is and what the rapture isn't. I don't really want to go there tonight. Yes, you can, Linda. Ask if we can obtain Jesus' writings. Much of the Dead Sea Scrolls are him or his brother James. Much of them. The way you have to tell is when partly the dating of them, but there's some other keynotes too. What I'd say is this: if you can get even if you get Giza Vermes translations, Giza Vermes is one of the original people that were studying the scrolls, and he didn't bring anything out really either of any. I mean, there was a lot of significant stuff, but it was in scholarly circles. It wasn't until Eisenman forced bring them out to the public. But if you can get Eisenman's translations of the Dead Sea Scrolls with Michael Wise, and this is only partial. This is an example of one here. This is an Eisenman book with Michael Wise, they were doing the translations. You can read some of that. Now, what I've read you today is not in here, but you can get other books by Eisenman and Wise on the Dead Sea Scroll translations. Look them up on Amazon. You can also get, like I said, Giza Vermes is a good one, and there are others. And in my estimation, you're going to get some differences. A lot of the people that translate the Dead Sea Scrolls do it with some bias towards the institutions that are either paying them to do it or that they belong to, so they have a vested interest. So it's best to read several different ones. This one here is pretty close. You can feel it in the words when you read it. When you read Jesus' words, they penetrate you. And again, his name wasn't Jesus. His name was probably Joseph, nicknamed Yosef. And he had 3 brothers, James, Kepha, and Jude. It's mentioned in the New Testament. They try to make Yosef in the New Testament the 4th brother of Jesus, but that's really who he is. That's the one that did it. That's the one that did it. And in my estimation, as I've explained before, he was in Josephus, he's called the Taheb, and that's the only crucifixion that we have that Pilate that talks about Pilate actually doing on his own, and that's the one. He was called the restorer. He believed in the law. He lived the law to the letter, not going beyond it, but meeting it. So he didn't go too far, but he went far enough. And he was very critical of others who tried to force the commandments of men, the doctrines of men, as if they were commandments. He didn't like that. If it couldn't be placed into the framework of Torah, he rejected it. Some people say, wow, there's a lot of crazy stuff in the Torah. I mean, and we could get into that sometime, but again, what's important is righteousness and piety. God doesn't expect you to know everything. What he expects you to do is have a hunger and thirst for righteousness and for truth. And he'll do the rest for you. I think that's probably the way to say it. All right. Hour, almost 2 hours long. Wow. A lot of that preparatory business, but I felt like you needed to get some of that background. So in ending, the resurrection of the man you know of Jesus Christ, in fact, did happen. And I've given some information on that in my religion series. Did quite a presentation about 2 years ago, and then I added some stuff here recently. You can find it in the religion playlist. The resurrection definitely happened, and there was something about it with the quantum physics, quantum mechanics that are explained by Dr. Sacco, which I included in a video about 3 weeks ago. You can go back and look at those. People that tell you that the Shroud of Turin is a fake, it's exactly what it purports to be. The spirit and the body are the soul. And that reuniting is what we want. That's where we want to be. That's what we want to go to. The Edenic state, immortal. And then whatever God has for us after that is icing on the cake, however it's revealed to us. But that's what we want. That's where we want to be. Thanks everybody for coming. I hope that was worthwhile. I know I can get pretty verbose, and these are serious subjects. But we need to have a balance, as I've said before. What's going on in the world and our spiritual side. We have to have that tree that Abraham planted in the center between Ai and Bethel, between God and the world. Have a balance, both of the physical and the spiritual, or we're not going to make it. So rather than being dogmatic and all that, I'll just say, as long as you're seeking for the truth, that you're not trying to justify your preconceived notions, that you're not trying to obtain verification from others, but that you have a one-on-one personal relationship with God. You don't need an intermediator. Jesus wouldn't even want you to ask him to be. I know that's going to be rough. I talked about that in a video a while back where he said, whenever you ask in my name, what he's actually saying is, it was a bad translation from the Hebrew. It's actually whenever you ask in the name of mine, in other words, my God. That's the secret. But as long as you're honest, you'll find that eventually anyway. God works with each of us according to our capacities and our abilities. And our honesty with ourselves and with him, because you can't fool him, right? I mean, if this man here said things like he has his ears of dust, that he strayed in the spirit, that he was asking for purification, are we any better? You all take care out here.